Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about how equilibrium, free energy, and the chemical potential can be related for an electrochemistry reaction. So there are some central equations that relate these various mathematical parameters, and we'll start by defining those. So first, the free energy of a reaction, delta G, under standard conditions. Keep in mind this degree symbol here indicates standard conditions. That is going to be equal to the negative NFE, where N is the number of moles of electrons that are transferred in the balanced reaction, and F is given as Faraday's constant, or that's about 96,485 joules per mole of electrons times volt. So that tells us about the amount of charge that's carried per mole of electrons. And of course, the potential, as we've discussed in a previous lecture, is given with a unit of voltage. So if you plug in the standard potential, then we'll get the standard free energy change as a response. And notice that there's a negative sign here in front of the N. So that means that delta G and E always have the opposite sign. If one is positive, then the other is negative. And that's important to conceptualize.